engage, disrupt, adapt, repeat. You're listening to Pure Reinvention, the podcast for curious people.
Hi, and welcome to this edition of the Pure Reinvention podcast. Mike and I are here with you today to talk about supporting people on the reinvention journey. And we want to make sure that everybody understands that really that's what this podcast is about, to talk to people that are sharing their stories of either discovering reinvention for the first time or somebody who's been down the road for a while and what they've experienced on the way. Today, we're going to listen to a podcast with Aaron Wolowiec. And we heard from someone before this that they wanted to know more about the people we were interviewing. So, Mike, why don't you tell me, why did we pick Aaron?
Well, I think that's a really good question, Misty. And I want to go back, first of all, to your first comment, which was, why are we doing these podcasts to begin with? And the ability to create a support network so that people can really learn from others about this pure reinvention and adjusting to the world as the world is dramatically changing is a huge undertaking. And it can't be just the content that we have. It has to be the content that everybody has that we're sharing. So I appreciate you bringing that up because that's a really big thing. I think Aaron is a person who really embodies the changing landscape of how we learn. I think Aaron, from my standpoint, was very attractive to talk to because he really believes in a whole new way of learning, which allows people to make a difference. And I think as people listen to the podcast, they will see that he brings a very refreshing new vantage point to the educational process for adults that I think everybody can learn from.
I think so, and I think that I've known Aaron for a while. I think that he epitomizes, not just professionally, but personally, reinvention, constantly seeking change and new ways to become a fuller, broader person.
Aaron is making a tremendous contribution with the groups and the individuals that he works with. And the things that he has shared with us in this podcast, to me, are things that people can take and immediately put into play. Now, perhaps not exactly as he describes it, but by allowing yourself to think differently and behave differently and implement differently, my guess is we'll get different results, and that's what he's really advocating.
This interview is fascinating and opens so many doors, and you could dig in on multiple topics, so let's let everybody listen in.
Welcome to this edition of Pure Reinvention. We're here with Aaron Wolowiec, founder and president of Event Garde. I had a chance to meet Aaron on a number of occasions, and what has really impressed me about Aaron and his thought process is how Aaron is representing the new thought process in the association world, one that's desperately needed. And Aaron, you seem very comfortable sharing your opinions on what you view as the association world's needs. Welcome to Pure Reinvention.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here.
So Aaron, as we talked about the opportunity to drive meaningful change in the association world, how do we get started? How do we figure out whatever the why is and why we should do that?
Yeah, so I am constantly on my own sort of personal professional development journey, as well as with my staff. And one of the people, the thought leaders I've recently stumbled upon within the last 6 months to a year has been Sinek. He has a TED Talk and a variety of books, but I think that his focus is really about starting with why, really understanding what your organization, your association, your business is meant to do and to be able to communicate that effectively to others. I think that oftentimes associations and other organizations think about the benefits that they offer, but don't really dig deeper past that sort of surface level to really understand what their root cause is, what they're meant to do. And so I've had the opportunity to think about that myself and think about how I approach meetings, events, learning. And for me, it's really about my why is really about learning and networking in a new way, not sort of relying on the status quo, but really digging deeper past sort of the traditional professional development that we've all come to learn and expect from any sort of association meeting or conference, and to really learn and network in a new way. And so I think that's what we're really focused on today, and I think that's what we're really focused on in the future of associations is associations that stick to the status quo, that are pulling forward their objectives or outcomes from the previous year, and just inheriting sort of these status quo conferences are not going to be effective. Our members, our attendees, the public, have so many options for choosing where they're going to receive their learning and networking opportunities from, that it's the differentiating conferences, programs, meetings, events that are really going to be the most effective, that are going to continue to drive our bottom lines within our associations, particularly for those who gain a significant portion of their revenue from meetings and events. So that we have to be different, we have to be unique.
Aaron, as an emerging professional, somebody who's really making their own space in this new world, what was your defining moment when you began to recognize that the why might actually need to be the starting point of this entire process, as opposed to the end?
I completely remember the moment. I was, my first association job was in a statewide trade association. I worked there for just about 9 years. After several years of serving as the education director, I began to realize that focusing purely on logistics wasn't sufficient to make a really outstanding learning and networking experience for attendees, and really wanted to sort of shift that focus, maybe unbeknownst to me and maybe not as clear as I think about it now. But I really knew that it was time to think more strategically and to offer learning and networking experiences that were different, working with speakers and subject matter experts to develop curricula, to develop experiences that were truly unique and innovative. I didn't necessarily have the opportunity to do it as fully as I might like at that association, but that's what really catapulted me into the journey and the trajectory that I'm on now with my own business.
So in your dissatisfaction to get to that why, was your dissatisfaction you professionally, or were you beginning to recognize that the disconnect between what the association was delivering, because it was process oriented, it was the same thing at the same time, you began to recognize you were going to need a completely different vehicle in order to deliver what you wanted to deliver?
Yeah, I think that a couple of things. I vividly remember, I tell this story often, I vividly remember in my youth coming home from a full day of elementary school and dragging my sister, who is 4 years younger than me, down into the basement to play school. I have always had a fascination and curiosity for learning. I've always been personally interested in learning. I've had the opportunity to teach professionally at a local community college. And so that sort of inherent interest in learning has always existed. I think that at the time that my work became so logistically focused on process and procedure versus thinking strategically, thinking differently about learning and networking, I think that's the moment when I realized I had to do something different. So
that was the aha moment.
It was the aha moment for me. And I think that the interesting thing is oftentimes in our career journeys, we have these gut reactions. Part of this gut reaction is the way our brain works. So if you've read or if you've looked into any of the brain science in terms of the sections of the brain, the portions of the brain that provide gut reactions versus language, they are in two different segments of the brain. And so often we have the gut reaction first. That's the first brain we ever had as a mammal. And the portion of the brain that's connected to speaking didn't come until later. And so often we have these gut reactions before we're able to put them to words. And that's sort of what has happened to me, right? Is I knew I was having that gut reaction many years ago, and it's only now that I can connect the words to it.
What you're describing is something that Malcolm Gladwell would have called the tipping point,
right,
or
absolutely.
in one of his books where he begins to say our brain recognizes something as different, but we can't process it until
Correct.
later.
Yep.
We understand there's something there.
Yep.
The gut reaction, as
Yeah.
you described it, but exactly what we do with that and how we process it is somewhere delayed in that other part of the brain.
And I think our associations are at that point now. I think they understand that in order to compete with other associations, with their members, with consultants, with exhibitors, with other speakers that are all offering education, I think they understand in their gut they need to do something different. Where the challenge is putting your finger on exactly what that is.
Okay, so let's talk about what does one do when we have to start looking at something like learning in a different way and talk about reinventing the learning experience. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, so I think that the days of reaching out to a speaker, signing that contract and allowing free will to take hold are gone, right? So I vividly remember, because I didn't know better as a very young professional, doing just that. I'd reach out to a speaker, ask them, number one, are you available on this date? Number two, how much do you charge? And number three, do you have a topic that might work? Like really literally thinking about content or topic last and not being at the forefront. And so, the scary part is that I know things like that still happen. There are still iterations of that happening within our associations. And so my advice is that in order to transform learning, we have to develop a better partnership with our speakers and with our subject matter experts. So, that starts, I think, with the meeting professional, that starts with the education director, that starts with the CEO. It really starts with the association individual who's functionally responsible for securing, developing, coaching, mentoring speakers. And so from there, once you identify sort of that starting point, then I think it's a matter of developing process and procedure that can help develop a better learning experience. We know now things about the brain. It really does shock me that we've been on this planet for so long, and there's so little evidence, research about the brain. There is very little information that we know. But what we're starting to find out more and more now, as more learning research comes out relative to the brain, how the brain likes to learn, we should begin leveraging that brain science, the neuroscience of learning, into our associations, into the development of our programs. That means having clear expectations for speakers on sort of engagement activities, on visuals, just any variety of learning materials that are being used during the program, helping them understand that while they may be an expert on their specific content area, they may not be an expert in the delivery of learning. I'm really coaching, mentoring them to get to that point. Oftentimes, the association can't do it on its own. Certainly for our smaller associations in Michigan and around the country, they may not have the expertise to do it on staff, and so they need to work with external folks that can help them do that.
But Aaron, is there anything wrong with going for a small, or for any association of any size, or any business for that matter, partnering with someone who can add value as a means to be relevant to your customer base?
Right. I mean, I think that, starting with why you need to understand why are you hosting these events. I submit to you that every association program has two goals. They're either learning goals or networking goals. And from there, obviously, developing the best program possible is priority one. If that can be done internally, that's great. But if we're not leveraging brain science engagement activities, best practices, data trends research, then absolutely, I think we should be partnering with outside folks to help us do that.
So I want to go into this next question, which you started to introduce, which is this whole different way in which we network. But before we do that, is it fair to say that while as a society we've become absolutely phobic about the value of computers and how we've integrated technology into our worlds, however, the absolute best computer we'll ever have is our brain. And we're only using, or even understand, a very small fraction of how that wonderful piece of equipment works.
Absolutely. I mean, as I've said, I think we only know so little about the brain, and in relativity to what we know about how the brain likes to learn and process information and then retrieve and apply that information back in the workplace.
Which is adult learning, correct?
Right, which is adult learning. We only know a very little bit. And so it's incumbent upon us to research, to read books, to attend programs, to develop as learning professionals our own understanding about the brain so that we can then, further that understanding within our own association. I think that, as a faculty member who works with aspiring CMP professionals, certified meeting professionals, in thinking about those individuals and thinking about the transformation from 20, 30, 40 years ago, from the very logistics focused meeting planner to the now need to be much more strategically focused, learning and networking differently absolutely falls under that sort of component of being a more strategic planner. If we're not doing that, we're failing our members.
So as meeting planners, CEOs start to look at the learning as a true experience for there to be great value, how does networking fall into that next phase of how we're looking at networking differently?
So, I think that there's always speculation about the face-to-face meeting, right? So is the face-to-face meeting here to stay? Is it going to die? And my prediction for my lifetime and for the next one thereafter is that, we're going to continue.
Which you intend to be around for quite a while, right?
Which I intend to be for both generations I will be around for.
Okay.
My prediction is that the face-to-face meeting will always be around. I think that, the trend of maybe having fewer face-to-face meetings over the year or having them over fewer days is certainly going to continue as people tighten their budgets, as they look to other strategies for obtaining their continuing education. So no doubt there may be fewer and they may be fewer days, but they will continue to occur because of the fundamental need for human beings to have interaction with one another face to face. Sure. So people will continue to thrive and strive for and crave that face to face interaction. What I think is important for us to consider about networking is that in perhaps the old style or more traditional meeting, we thought maybe a 20-minute networking break where there was no program or structure was sufficient time for people to connect with one another. We thought that, that half-hour, 45-minute hour lunch where, again, there was no program or structure and people were just encouraged to eat was sufficient for people to network and to achieve their networking goals. But, you mentioned technology a little earlier, and I think that, especially for the new generation, but also for folks who are more experienced, like my parents, Facebook and social media is a way of life. People are connecting online each and every day. It is, to some extent, affecting their ability and interest and excitement to connect with one another face to face. I think that, on one hand, I've connected with many more people online before I've ever met them face to face, but attending that conference is one exciting opportunity for me to seek those people out and to meet them and to
put a face to someone that you have met before.
Absolutely. On the other hand, I think that we are disillusioned by our online networks. And during face-to-face conferences, some of us don't then seek out additional interactions and engagement. And so it becomes more challenging to meet new people, and it becomes more challenging to network and to get business done and to achieve your networking goals. And so, I think we have both types of people. There is a spectrum of sorts. But what I do know is that the future of networking in person, particularly at conferences, isn't about just putting people in a room any longer. It is about framing creative, interesting experiences, exercises, activities.
But you're describing purposeful. There's some purpose, right?
Absolutely. Purposeful. I like to use the word intentional.
Intentional. Good word.
Use of time, not only to think, because I think that oftentimes as planners in associations, we fill up every moment of every day and there isn't enough white space sufficient to think or process or reflect. So that's one thing. But I think that this other aspect is intentionally creating fun, interesting, engaging opportunities for people to connect around topics that are important to them.
I think this is absolutely a enlightening thought process to get away from random collisions and really get to intentional focus. And networking then becoming very attractive to people because it's very intentional in what the outcome is going to be as opposed to some sort of random guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that has to be super structured. It doesn't have to be forced. I think you still try to give adult learners as much opportunity to own their own journey and to make choices and selections. But at the end of the day, given the choice between going to the bar for a beer or intentionally networking with folks, I think you do make the selection to intentionally network when given the opportunity to do so. When not given the opportunity to do so, you sort of choose your own path, which is maybe less effective or less learning or networking outcome.
Which interestingly enough, would seem to tie into the learning outcomes that you described earlier,
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
is the learning outcomes are completely flipped, so that the networking component becomes a logical extension of how I learn, as
Absolutely.
opposed to the white space
Right.
and random collisions.
Well, I think that, just sort of as an aside, I think we are seeing so much emphasis and focus moving forward on bite-sized learning, on this idea that people want to learn as much as possible in 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, whether it be in person or online. And that's fine to introduce maybe one or two very easy to understand topics, but to truly learn is to not only sort of gain new information, but to store that in your long-term memory, to retrieve it back at your workplace, to apply it to your work, and to have some meaningful outcome to either yourself, your department, or your organization. And so these networking opportunities become an extension of those bite-sized learning experiences in the classroom for people to actually process and discuss what it is they've just been introduced to.
And employers will want to invest in those because there is an absolute direct ROI back to your job.
Look, I mean, I have a client right now who I just reviewed a bunch of data from their most recent conference, and line after line after line in the survey data says, my employer won't pay for me to go. My employer doesn't understand why I would want to do this. I can go if I pay for myself or take time off from work, et cetera, et cetera. And every industry will be different. But the sad part of that data is that the employer doesn't understand what's coming back to the workplace. And maybe there isn't anything coming back to the workplace, and maybe that's the problem. And so working with speakers and subject matter experts to close that gap, to not have education sessions that are just a knowledge dump, but rather a playground to be introduced to new topics, and then to give subsequent opportunities.
Curiosity.
Right.
Oh, absolutely.
And to create subsequent opportunities to really dig deeper into that, process it, assimilate it into their own workplace is key.
Okay, so you brought up this whole concept of data. Okay, and for us to learn how to use data to our advantage to really create new and meaningful learning and networking opportunities.
Yeah.
How does data fit into this entire conversation?
So, I think we constantly need to be assessing how well our conferences are performing in achieving our two primary goals, learning and networking. What I find in many associations, many organizations, and many conferences in general is we're still using these sort of Likert scale smile sheets that we rate how well we like the location on a scale from 1 to 5, or how well we liked the education on a scale from 1 to 5. And what we find year over year, whether we're drilling down to an individual session, to a keynote speaker, to the entire conference overall, is that we're boiling all of that work down into a single number, right? So we might say that as a result of this year, our conference was rated overall 4.88. And maybe if we compare that to last year, our conference rated a 4.7, and maybe to the year before that, maybe a 4.9. The problem is that those numbers are completely meaningless. We've boiled down data to nothing. We've boiled it down past the point of meaning. And so while it's important to collect data, it's important to collect meaningful data. And so instead of asking questions like, how well do you rate the speaker on a scale from 1 to 5, instead, couldn't or shouldn't we be asking the question, did the speaker use a learning tactic that engaged your visual learning style? Or did you have an opportunity during the session to process a case study? Or did you get to work with a partner or a small group? Yes, no questions that are very cut and dry and are very clear on the experience that we're delivering. And then couldn't we or shouldn't we 30, 60, 90 days, 6 months to a year after the program, not for every conference or meeting, but for the ones that are most meaningful to us, like our annual conference, shouldn't we then be reaching out to our attendees and say, did you utilize or retrieve a piece of information from the client, from your conference, that has made your working experience better, or that has provided a return to your employer. That's the data we need to know. Innately, planners that have any experience whatsoever know which hotels are going to perform well or not. Before you've even left the meeting if the food was good or bad. I mean, we're asking questions that we already know the answers to. And at the end of the day, I'll just remind us that if we start with why, if we remember our why is to learn and to network differently, a lot of those other things can fall away because they don't mean anything.
How does all of this then fit into Detroit, the city of, what it's going through in its reinvention process, and ASAE being in Detroit in August of 2015?
So, let's start with the city. I think that the city has innately done this over the past several years. The city knows that it has learned and networked differently in order to come out of the place that it was in, right? So there is so much to learn and do and to network within the city that it makes sense to curate that information in the best way we know how, and to share that with others so that that information isn't lost, that we don't repeat history, but instead we learn from it. And so that's where the ASAE edutainers and free time activities really come into play. So, let's start with the edutainers. I think that the edutainers are really an innovation in learning and networking differently. What we're really doing is taking participants to different locations within the city that have a story to tell. And not a sales story, but really a meaningful historical case study on what went wrong and how it was resolved. And so we'll have 9 different locations like that within the city where that destination will have 20 minutes to really sort of share its story and to present a problem or challenge that most association professionals can relate to. And then we'll follow that 20 minutes up with another 20 minutes that's really focused on what is the connection, what is the bridge to the association, what can the chief staff executive and what can every staff professional within our associations learn from that experience, and how does perhaps an experience at the parade company, for example, relate to volunteer management. Obviously, the parade company requires an inordinate number of volunteers in order to be successful. And the parade company knows and understands not only how to recruit, but how to retain, how to train, how to coach and mentor volunteers for maximum effectiveness to pull off what is either a countrywide known or worldwide known parade every year, right? So how does that relate to, and what does that look like within associations? We know and understand that our associations are ineffective without our volunteers. We obviously have to recruit, retain, mentor, and train our volunteers as well. And so the Edutainment will be a space to sort of play through both what the parade company knows, but also sort of the present challenge within associations. And then we'll wrap up with some opportunities for people to process what they've learned, what they've heard within the context of their own organization.
But it sounds to me like what you're beginning to describe here in the learning experience of the edutainers is the opportunity to discover, and in the opportunity to create their own vision of, because in your parade company example, the parade company has this vision of what the successful event is. And then they work that backwards to make sure all that happens. In this particular example you're using, the discovery process that you expose them to creates the curiosity to ask the questions, and you apparently are giving them the time and space to then connect those things together to perhaps come out with a different thought process than when they went in.
Right, so let's think about the reverse. Let's think about what the reverse is. If we wanted to train association professionals on volunteer management, we could easily put them in a classroom with an expert in volunteer management at the front of the room, at the helm, sharing their best practices and what they know to be the quote-unquote right way to recruit, retrain, train, coach, and mentor speakers, right? So we could do that. That's the flip side. That's the lecture. That's the talking head. had. But instead, we're thinking about a more effective strategy about pulling these folks into the community, learning firsthand what's happening within the city of Detroit, giving them the curiosity to talk about that topic, and then to let them, with their colleagues, process out what the answer is or what their next steps might look like within their own organization. A much more effective strategy, much more learner-centric strategy, and certainly something, let's put these two experiences side by side. As an adult learner, which would you like to participate in?
What an absolutely engaging philosophy. I want to really thank you, Aaron, for your time today. This has just been very, very thought-provoking.
Thanks so much.
Wow, Mike, my head is spinning from that interview. So much good information.
Aaron was a wonderful interview, and we're very lucky to have had him as a podcast.
I'm tired. It was a mental marathon. That's all I kept thinking. This is a beautiful dig into so many topics that we talk about on a regular basis.
I think what seems to be so overwhelming is Aaron is absolutely convinced that a lot of what we've done traditionally in the past needs to be turned upside down, and that how we send people to conferences, what they're expected to learn, how we measure it, why employers may or may not be sending people to conferences. I mean, it's just a wonderful, wonderful thought process to engage in.
So he was just talking about the edu-tours that are happening at ASAE and in Detroit, and how they're bringing the city to participants. They're bringing participants into the city, which is a great concept. How do you think that will shape Detroit in the coming years?
Well, I think that what Aaron talks about is, we bring people into these conferences and we do this knowledge dump, and then we expect them on a scale of 1 to 5 to tell us whether they really enjoyed it or not, and are not paying attention to whether there was any sort of meaningful learning experience, especially that applies on the job 6 months or 12 months later. If you can get people, for example, into the city of Detroit, to get them to experience and touch and feel and actually be active with whatever concept you're trying to teach them, using the behaviors of the city as reinforcement. Those are the kinds of discoveries that will allow people to make the transition of how those behaviors could impact their own work, their own job, and their own value they bring to their employers. We can't do that in a sterile classroom or in a conference where everybody's sitting in a group of 300 classroom style watching some PowerPoint.
Right.
We have to get to where we can engage people in groups, where people can get their hands on things and actually teach them how to bring new deliverables to the marketplace.
I don't think I'm alone in the fact that's how I like to learn. I think that's how a lot of adult learners like to learn, is doing it. We spend so much time learning on the fly, adjusting in flight, and making all these decisions. We're better when our hands are on it and we're actively engaged in something than just sitting in front of a presenter in a sterile classroom.
Aaron talked about why employers may not be sending people to conferences, and to me that was just some of the most startling information that he shared. And it got me really thinking that maybe the reason people don't get sent to conferences and why training budgets shrink and is one of the first things to get cut when there's a downturn is because there hasn't been the kind of fundamental shift that Aaron is talking about, that we just have sent people to the knowledge dump instead of really being fundamentally different in how we teach.
I like the example he uses, a playground. It should be a playground because that's a nice safe spot where you can explore different ideas, talk about what's happening, and take a risk, but just sort of a risk in theory before you go pitch it to your board and put it into play.
I think that is absolutely right. So if you watch a group of people that are just getting information dumped on, they're sitting back and they're not really engaged. But if you think about a playground, or if you think about where people are really enjoying what's happening, they're leaning forward, they're wanting to get their hands on it, they're wanting to touch it, they're wanting to experience it, they're wanting to feel what it's like to be involved in it. And that's when you can start to mimic those behaviors when you go back to work. And that's the difference.
Just the way you describe that makes me want to go do something like that. I want to be at a conference or at a place where I'm learning in that kind of environment. And it was startling to hear that the employers aren't seeing the value of sending their staff. That's a huge lesson. But what it made me think of, too, is why aren't we engaging those staff when they come back from those events? So sharing it with the rest of the staff that didn't go. Pick 2 ambassadors, send them to the workshop, send them to the general sessions, and you come back and have a half day at work where you guys talk about what they learned. And I think that's such a good opportunity.
I think that's absolutely right, Misty. So you have this whole opportunity to fundamentally reshape the way training and teaching and conferences and learning and education and edutaurs in Detroit, all of those things, how they impact and add value to an employer going forward instead of just for that moment that they're participating at the conference. And if we can make that fundamental shift into that new dimension, we have a real chance at making a huge difference in the success that people will enjoy as they attend these learning experiences.
And what Aaron really taught us the whole time, everything he talked about was flipping things on its ear, doing them differently, reinventing, not just changing up one or two speakers, but reinventing the delivery process and the in-depth networking that's happening and make it authentic, engaging, and new.
And Misty, that's what pure reinvention is all about.
You're right. That is what Pure Reinvention is all about. And it's all about the community and the support that we get from our listeners. So we would encourage you guys to comment on Facebook, send us messages on Twitter or via email, which is info@purereinvention.com. We want to hear from you. Ideas for new stories, ideas for people to interview, or just to hear about what you're going through. Share it with us. Remember, if you're ready to make a change, make it a change that lasts. Make it Pure Reinvention.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pure Reinvention. Keep the conversation going and get alerts when new podcasts are up by following us on Twitter @Pure Reinvention or sign up for our mailing list at purereinvention.com.